Thanks for coming. Welcome to the keynote address of the 30th anniversary of the Women's Studies program at Iowa State. I'm Diane Price-Herndl, director of the program, and I want to thank our co-sponsors for the event, the Departments of Anthropology, Sociology, English, and Speech Communication, the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics and the Catt Associates, the Margaret Sloss Women's Center, the YWCA at Ames, the Center for Excellence in the Arts and Humanities, the George Gund Fund, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Miller Lecture Fund, and the Society for Professional Journalists. Is that what you wanted, Pat? And, of course, of the student body. Women's Studies is an academic discipline that is committed to scholarship on issues that are relevant to women and that challenges existing systems of knowledge. We're dedicated to understanding the contributions, history, and diversity of women. And since 1977, the Women's Studies program at Iowa State has been bringing that work to our students. Thanks. Tonight, we bring you a speaker who's been writing about inequality and injustice in the U.S. for more than 20 years. Susan Faludi won the Pulitzer Prize in 1991 for a story about the human costs of a leveraged buyout of the Safeway stores. 1991 also saw the publication of her first book, Backlash, The Undeclared War on American Women, a book that Newsweek called, quote, as important as de Beauvoir's The Second Sex and Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, unquote. It also won the National Book Critics Circle Award that year for nonfiction. Backlash became a bestseller and propelled her into the national limelight as an unofficial representative of the feminist movement. In Backlash, Faludi works as an investigative reporter to debunk many of the stories based on the myth that women's so-called freedom was making them unhealthy and unhappy, and uncovers rampant resistance to feminism's gains for women. To try to uncover why there was such resistance to the modest gains that women had made, Faludi turned next to the question of why men were resisting the feminist movement in the first place. After 6 years of interviewing men from all walks of life in the U.S., she published Stiffed, The Betrayal of the American Man, which concludes that men of the 1990s felt betrayed by a culture that had set out masculine ideals of social responsibility and caretaking, but then had given in to a rampant capitalist ethos that demanded good looks and ridiculous wealth, while denying men ways to be socially useful and valuable. In her most recent book, and the basis for tonight's talk, Susan Faludi looks at the reassertion of stereotypical gender myths after the attacks of September 11, 2001. Chuck Leddy of the Christian Science Monitor calls her new book, The Terror Dream, quote, the most thought-provoking and eye-opening book yet about this nation's reaction to 9/11. Kirkus Reviews calls it brilliant, illuminating, and essential. Unlike so many other speakers in Iowa this time of the election cycle, Susan Faludi is not running in the Iowa caucuses. That means her computer won't be calling your phone during dinner time, and she doesn't want your vote. But she would probably be pleased were you to buy her new book, available from the university bookstore table after the talk, and she will be happy to sign it at the reception we'll be holding in the back after the question and answer. So please welcome Susan Faludi.
Thank you for that. I wouldn't turn down your vote. Can you all hear me? Good. Okay. Wave if you can't. I'm really glad to be here in a place where people care about the liberal arts and know that understanding them is crucial to understanding the world around us. I say that having just come off a book tour where the media I kept encountering had no understanding of that, and as a result, kept demanding that I defend what will seem to you rather elementary concepts, such as history. Our history informs our culture, or culture is something that is transmitted through time. So it's a blessing to be in a room where people may allow me to make such statements without utter non-comprehension. Before I start, I also want to thank you and say how much I appreciate your being here, because I know there are a lot of people who may think they've heard enough about September 11, 2001 by November 12th, 2007. But I really feel we are just getting around to talking about the deeper meaning of so much that's happened in this country since that awful day. On 9/11, individual Americans responded reasonably and courageously, but the nation as a whole reacted in ways that, on reflection, are truly strange and disturbing and beg for explanation. Let me give you a few examples of what I mean. You may remember that politicians and pundits at the time were spouting all kinds of odd vigilante rhetoric about how we should, well, you remember Bush, smoke them out of their holes, or in the words of a New York columnist, we should shoot them between the eyes. John Wayne kept coming up, and there were all kinds of references to our war on terror, being like that of our old Indian wars and back to the days of taming the frontier. The media was also claiming that the attacks would bring back traditional family arrangements. Now, you may not recall some of this, well, for some of you, because you were quite young then and maybe not, focused on reading the papers, but for others, for the rest of us, because it washed over us at the time with very little inspection. But there was this insistence in the media then that 9/11 would bring about a marriage boom, a baby boom, a return to full-time domesticity. Even feminism was said to be deep-sixed by the attacks, or maybe I shouldn't say even, since feminism seems to be blamed for everything. But I had an early warning of this last dynamic on the very afternoon of 9/11. A few hours after the towers fell, my phone rang, and it was a reporter doing a reaction story. Mostly, though, he seemed eager to share with me his reaction, which was, and I quote, "Well," he said, "this sure pushes feminism off the map." Now, in the next few weeks, I received several more calls like this. A reporter from the New York Observer phoned to get my comment on the trend of women, quote, becoming more feminine after 9/11. A New York Times reporter called soon after to discuss women's supposed new preference for muscle men who would protect them from attack in the home. Now, this was all not only baffling, but not how other countries who have suffered terrorist attacks, say England or Spain, have responded. It seems peculiar to us as a nation. So today, I don't want to talk to you about what 9/11 did to Americans. I want to talk to you about what 9/11 revealed about America. Because I came to feel that underlying our reactions to September 11 is a cultural mythology that we have barely begun to reckon with. And it holds a key to a number of mysteries. For instance, why, when the hijackers had aimed the planes at the symbols of commercial and military power, were we acting as if we needed to save the American home and hearth? Why, when we'd been attacked by men who hate Western women's liberation, were our pundits, so many of them eager to usher in the end of feminism? Why, when we've been called on to fight a, quote, new type of war in the global age, were our leaders reaching for their coonskin caps? Why, with all of the crises we had to deal with was there such a to-do about the rescue of one girl, Private Jessica Lynch. Now, I want to talk to you about all of these aspects, but first I want to start with another question. And to answer it, I want to take a brief foray into American history. Perhaps the most mysterious of the contradictions was this one. We kept hearing over and over from the same leaders in media who kept invoking the old frontier that these attacks were something that had never happened to us before. America, we kept hearing, is not a nation that's vulnerable to assault on home soil. Now, in recent times, that's true. But if we actually consider America's real history, we learn something very important. This has happened to us before, over and over, and its happening was essential to the formation of the American character. For the first 200 years, the main feature of colonial American life was being attacked on quote-unquote home soil. Now, needless to say, this was home soil that settlers had taken from the native population. Nevertheless, the settlers felt they were being attacked by people they regarded and demonized as non-Christian, non-white terrorists. These were attacks aimed at villages, communities. In that respect, they were aimed at the home and hearth. These were also deeply traumatic attacks for all concerned. King Philip's War, which began in 1675, was the formative confrontation between white settlers and the New England tribes. It stands to this day as per capita America's deadliest war. In 1 year, 1 of every 10 men of military age in the Massachusetts Bay Colony were killed. 2/3 of New England towns were attacked. More than half of them were utterly destroyed. Settlers retreated nearly to the coast, and the society fell into what came to be known as the Great Crisis. Indian suffering and casualties were, of course, even worse. The bitterness unleashed on both sides would initiate a series of harrowing conflicts that dragged on well into the 18th century. Those conflicts reduced early settlers to a state of perpetual insecurity, what the eminent frontier historian Richard Slotkin called, quote, an atmosphere of terror. How did we as a nation respond in the years to come to this foundational experience? Largely by covering it up with the creation of a cultural myth. Beginning in the 18th century and culminating in the Victorian era, our culture, its journalists, novelists, artists, politicians, sculptors, concocted a fantasy that post-revolutionary America desperately wanted to believe. A myth of ourselves as triumphal rescuers. The myth of American invincibility. Now, in talking about this, I'm not talking about some sort of recovered memory syndrome. We didn't remember the original trauma. In this culture, it's a miracle if we remember anything that happened a year ago, unless it involves Britney Spears. But what I'm talking about is a tangible cultural heritage, a worldview whose instructions are handed down in everything from newspaper accounts to novels to movie scripts. And furthermore, I'm talking about a myth that doesn't necessarily belong to one sex or another. Men and women both believe in it. But thanks to its history, it has a gender aspect. Our early experience of terror was deeply humiliating to the settler community. Time and again, leaders, militias, husbands were not able to protect families in frontier towns, nor to rescue them. Between the late 17th and early 18th century, roughly more than a quarter of New England women who were taken captive were never rescued, and a whopping 60% of girls were never rescued. Moreover, 1/3 of women who were taken captive chose to remain with their captors, preferring Indian life. Male settlers suffered the further mortification of hearing many female captives denounce their failed efforts, or perhaps worse, announce how they, the women, had managed to defend themselves without male help. Mary Rowlandson, who wrote the most famous account of her captivity, told how she negotiated shrewdly with her captors and named her own ransom. Hannah Dustin, another famous case, she was abducted from her home after giving birth to her 12th child. As the Indian warriors ran in the door, her husband ran in and then ran right out. And she, in her later account, announced how she had freed herself by killing 10 Indians. These were the kind of accounts that got rewritten and rewritten until male shame had been turned into an exaggerated ironclad male valor, and female strength had been derided and turned into exaggerated helplessness. To give you one example involving Hannah Dustin, Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was one of a number of literary luminaries in the Victorian era who went after Hannah, he turned her husband, Thomas, from this skedaddler into a mighty hero on horseback who had wiped out hordes of Indians, and turned Hannah Dustin into a, quote, bloody old hag who should be expunged from the history books. And the women who weren't turned into hags were turned into frail creatures in danger of rape unless they were rescued. It is in this way that we ended up with Natty Bumppo in The Last of the Mohicans, Buffalo Bill, and all these other dime store cowboy heroes, rescuing helpless white young women. All the way down to the modern era of movies, to the Klan Night Riders saving virginal white women from rape in Birth of a Nation, to John Wayne saving Little Debbie from Comanche desecration in the 1956 Western classic The Searchers, to Tom Cruise saving his daughter from not only Martian attack, but a skulking molester in a farmhouse in Spielberg's post-9/11 film War of the Worlds. The point is, this is a general myth of national character, but because of its origins, it relies on a formula based on female and male roles. The formula goes, the nation is strong because its men are brave and capable protectors. But men can't be shown to be brave and capable unless women are weak and in need of a male savior. So now let me return us to September 11. On that day, you could say we suffered 2 attacks. A physical attack that destroyed buildings and people, and a symbolic attack that shattered the American myth of invincibility. In response, our culture deployed some heavy artillery to repair the myth. How did we do this? By using a trumped-up domestic drama to cover over our vulnerability. Now, this expressed itself in a variety of ways, some of which are exceedingly frivolous and silly. Other ways are important and dangerous. So let me start with the silly. Look at some of the messages we were getting after 9/11. By the end of 10/11, I counted 4 articles in the New York Times alone that claimed 9/11 was going to cause single career women to repent their independence and rush to the wedding altar. One of these articles actually advised women to take as their model the Twin Towers, which the New York Times claimed were like a Mr. and Mrs., a, quote, long married couple caught up in a 30-year romance. Single women who didn't hurry up and get married, the Times said, would be seen as, quote, out of sync with the country's renewed sense of purpose, small-minded and unpatriotic. You could see this sort of line forming all over the media, Newsweeklies predicted that 9/11 would take a deep mental toll on the unmarried because they would have no one to call if their plane was hijacked. I'm sure that's the first thing you would think of if your plane was hijacked. CBS's The Early Show summoned these unwed women to the set and urged them to talk about, quote, the void you must now feel. Even the tabloid The Star published a special post-9/11 issue where Hollywood celebrities berated themselves for failing to commit to marital life. 9/11 was also supposedly driving women to the nursery. The press claimed that the attack had set off women's biological clocks, and having babies was now women's, quote, patriotic duty, as New York Magazine put it. Women were also said to be responding to 9/11 by returning to homemaking. The Los Angeles Times said that the shock of the attacks was, quote, pushing some of the country's best prepared career women towards stay-at-home motherhood. Time magazine predicted women would stock up on meatloaf pans and sewing machines. Stay home, the magazine said. Sew your own drapes and dresses. TV programmers announced that in 2002, the news shows for the, quote, post-9/11 inspired season would be dramas about women returning to the home. Even the fashion industry promoted what it called crisis couture, which we were told would be all about chiffon, baby doll dresses, and virginal white lace. Women, Vogue magazine told us, would now want outfits that were, quote, distinctively non-aggressive and no longer about dominance or power. Well, there was a tremendous amount of this silliness, but it also had a serious side. Right after the attacks, there were an alarming number of articles and commentaries accusing women, specifically feminists, of weakening our military, undermining our resolve to fight, and exhibiting traitorous behavior. Many feminist critics were vilified in extremely ugly ways. More generally, women's voices began vanishing from op-ed pages and news talk shows. In the first 7 weeks following the attacks, the number of women guests on Sunday morning news programs shrank by 40%. Even women who were heads of congressional subcommittees dealing with terrorism, like Senators Feinstein and Boxer, made no appearances on these shows. Now, while women were being shrunk, male political leaders were being inflated. Our politicians were reimagined as superheroes and powerlifters. The media called Bush, approvingly, Top Gun, Superman, Bullet Man, and America's Dragon Slayer. Newsweek told us we shouldn't fear because Bush was, quote, a fighting machine who has dropped 15 pounds and cut his time in the mile to 7 minutes. Vanity Fair ran a cover story photo essay describing Bush and his cabinet as, quote, the Magnificent Seven. The magazine actually assigned kind of raw-knuckled nicknames to each of Bush's men. So Cheney, for example, was dubbed The Rock. Ashcroft was The Heat, and Tom Ridge was The Protector. Vanity Fair drew special attention to Tom Ridge's, quote, prominent Buzz Lightyear jaw, which gave him the right appearance for a director of Homeland Security. The new post-9/11 American man was said to be a red meat eater. A Washington Post article declared that thanks to 9/11, we were, quote, heading back into a time when real men bring home the bacon and their women cook it up. Rudy Giuliani was described in Newsweek as a man who ate, quote, meats that sweat. And when cabinet members gathered in Camp David right after the attacks, much was made of the fact that they dined on what was billed as a, quote, Wild West menu of buffalo meat. All of these stories were eventually characterized by one nationally syndicated columnist this way. So long, sissy boys. Goodbye, sensitive man. After 30 years of wimpifying its men, turning us all into spit-shine, dough-balled, egg-headed, girly boys who can clip a cuticle, manly men are back in vogue. Guys who are not afraid to get their hands dirty and who don't necessarily worry about washing them before eating a liverwurst and onion sandwich. And this is the model of manhood that women were supposedly swooning to date after 9/11, according to the newspapers. My favorite article in this regard, which ran in the Orange County Register, declared, quote, dating a fireman now is as de rigueur as toting the latest Louis Vuitton bag or waxing away stray eyebrow hairs. This reporter didn't actually have any real-life examples of women lusting after firemen, so she got her newspaper to pay a fireman to take her on a date. On television, the new manly man wasn't just a hunky firefighter. Increasingly, he was a violent vigilante. A study by the group Human Rights First found that acts of torture on primetime television shows had gone from fewer than 4 a year before 9/11 to more than 100. And the torturers, who in the past were almost entirely the victims, were now so often the show's heroes. These were heroes emulated by so many U.S. soldiers in Iraq that the military brass ultimately met with the producers of the show 24 to beg them to stop exalting torture. And then there was the return of John Wayne. There were all these media salutes to the Duke being back. TV networks offered endless reruns of John Wayne westerns. Hollywood produced a special post-9/11 tribute to American heroism, showcasing Wayne. This was a film that ran on 1/4 of American movie theaters as a kind of old-fashioned newsreel as a preview, and then was sent to classrooms across the country as a, quote, study guide. And the recording industry even reissued John Wayne's America, Why I Love Her, with the Duke reciting patriotic speeches. Now, some of this may sound odd, but relatively harmless, if it weren't for the fact that it took over our public life, starting with our presidential politics. Look at the 2004 presidential campaign, where the candidates seemed to be competing for the title of Davy Crockett in chief. They were bragging about their gun collections. Bush was hacking away at sagebrush and tree stumps. Kerry was shooting wild animals and waving the bloody pelts at journalists. And I thought, actually, I'd read you just a little snippet from a section of my book that just to give you a taste of what was going on for those of you who, for example, weren't reading Field and Stream at the time. By the end of the 2004 campaign, Bush was declining almost all newspaper requests for interviews. But he made an exception in the hunting and fishing media. He offered long sessions to Field and Stream and Outdoor Life, publications that had never before been granted an audience with the president. The reporter for Field and Stream recalled getting a personal tour of Bush's Crawford, Texas ranch in a pickup truck, the president himself at the wheel, before being ushered into his private study, where, without prompting, Bush hastened to a cabinet, quote, opened a gun safe and started handing me some of his favorites. And then I'll just read a little from the transcript of this interview. President Bush, My favorite gun is the first gun that my dad gave me, which is a Winchester 22 pump, Model 61. Another gun that's one of my favorites is a Weatherby custom-made gun presented to me by the CEO of the company, Mr. Weatherby. I've probably got 6 or 7 guns in a safe in my office there. 2 shotguns, two 225, a couple of deer rifles, and a varmint rifle, a 248. Field and Stream's reporter Sid Evans. A 243 maybe? President Bush. A 243, I beg your pardon, a 243. Given to me by the former Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Bob Bullock, my old buddy, who on his deathbed said, "I want to give you a gun." And just skipping a little bit ahead to give you a taste of the carry aspect of this. When the candidates picked up their guns, they weren't just stalking the flannel jacket set. They were hunting the vote of haunted America, a nation vulnerable to the enticements of protection fantasies. A Kerry campaign brochure spelled out the underlying agenda with a photograph of the candidate holding a shotgun titled, "John Kerry will defend Ohio." Kerry devoted an inordinate amount of his campaign to peddling his hunting credentials. On a swing through the Midwest in July 2004, Kerry stopped to brandish a 12 gauge at the Gunslick Trap Club in Holman, Wisconsin, before hurrying on to La Crosse, where he had the campaign bus pull over so he could demonstrate his shooting prowess at a clay pigeon skeet range. The following day, he stopped to expound on his deer hunting techniques with a group of journalists. Quote, "I go out with my trusty 12-gauge double barrel, crawl around on my stomach," Kerry told them. "I track and move and decoy and play games and try to outsmart them. You know, I kind of play the wind. That's hunting." His eagerness to underscore his double barrel talents would earn him the media moniker John the Deer Slayer. While sawing away at a steak dinner one night, he regaled Washington Post writer Laura Blumenfeld with the details of dove gutting. "Carve out the heart," he told the dismayed reporter. "Pull out the entrails and cut up the meat. You clean them, let them hang. It takes 3 or 4 birds to have a meal. You might eat it at a picnic, cold roasted. I love dove." Just in case you think the syndrome is over, in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago, their story on Mitt Romney noted how Romney earlier this year had been telling the press that he'd, quote, "been a hunter pretty much all my life. I've hunted small game numerous times." He made a number of these statements before having to back off when it turned out he was, as he admitted, any description of my being a hunter is an overstatement of capability. When the candidates weren't locking and loading, they were vowing to protect mothers and their children from supposedly marauding terrorists in the suburbs. Bush announced that he was guarding us from enemies who would strike our homes, and Kerry said that he would fight terrorism because it was, quote, "my sacred duty to protect the bond between a mother and child." So here we have all the elements of the myth: the strong, inflated man, the woman cowering back at the homestead. All that's missing is the rescue of the girl, preferably one who's in danger of being violated. And that's where the Jessica Lynch story comes in, a story that agitated our culture for months on end. Most of you probably remember how this story went. Supposedly, special ops teams battled their way into an Iraqi hospital in a dangerous midnight raid to rescue Lynch from bloodthirsty Fedayeen death squads, who, it was insinuated, had raped her. Now, in reality, there was no fight, and there were no death squads, as the military, it turned out, knew. It was just a bunch of doctors and nurses who were trying to take care of Lynch and actually had been trying to return her to the U.S. military. And Lynch herself said she has no memory of being raped. But that story of the daring raid and the helpless rescued girl was very important to us as a culture. Now, right after the news of the rescue mission, there was a certain amount of debunking on the question of whether Jessica Lynch had shot her gun or not. One day story in the Washington Post, said that she shot till she ran out of bullets. The Post immediately the next day retracted that story, and then denounced it further in 3 columns by its ombudsman and in a 5,600-word article correcting the record. In spite of that, the rest of the media spent months decrying the story. But there's one element of the lasting story of Lynch that has not been debunked, and that's the transformation of a soldier who enlisted not once but twice into a delicate little maiden. So I thought I'd read you one more little bit from my book that sort of summarizes how the media remade Jessica Lynch. We cast our male soldiers returning from the war zone as battle-tested, seasoned, tougher, old beyond their years. But the post-war Jessica Lynch would be lauded not for her hard-won maturity, but for having remained a girl. Her virtue lay in her preserved and aspic innocence. She hasn't changed one bit, a typical media report assured, after consulting with her kindergarten teacher. The celebration of her perpetual childhood began immediately with media accounts from the military hospital in Germany that described her as, quote, the tiny girl and the blonde waif. She was said to be clutching a teddy bear. She was said to favor applesauce and steamed carrots. She was said to be dreaming of washing her hair and styling it with a curling iron. She was said to be asking for her mother. Stateside, reporters flocked to Palestine, West Virginia, her hometown, to harvest sugar and spice details from her childhood. Her grandmother, the media reported, called her precious little Jessie. Little Jessie was, according to various dispatches, a princess laying out her clothes every night who liked her hair ribbons to match her outfits, and a little girl who loved pink dresses and perfect hair. We learned that she, quote, once fractured her arm and insisted on a pink cast to go with her pink shoelaces, presided as the Work County Fair's Miss Congeniality, couldn't hit the ball at all in softball, wore small-waisted dresses, and was every mother's dream of a teenage daughter. When former New York Times reporter Rick Bragg sat down to write his account of Lynch, called I Am a Soldier Too, some months later, he devoted a chapter titled Princess to the enumeration of her maidenly attributes. The chapter's first sentence, her bangs were always perfect. The biography of a good girl follows. She was born tiny and beautiful, a doll-like little girl who was almost as quiet as one and never any trouble. She cried her first day or so in Linda Davies' kindergarten class because she missed her mom, he wrote. In middle school, she was a cheerleader in little pleated skirts. Even while playing school sports, she was always perfectly made up. As Miss Congeniality, she was radiant in her burgundy form-hugging gown. In other words, the princess belonged in beauty pageants, not boot camp. Her fatigue swallowed her like a big frog, Bragg wrote. She looked like a child who had sneaked into her daddy's closet and tried on his uniform to play soldier, unquote. I Am a Soldier Too seemed an ironic title for a book dedicated to proving the opposite. Now, you could see these rescue fantasies playing out in all kinds of ways, like the famous $17 million ad that featured Bush giving a protective hug to a girl whose mother died in the World Trade Center, in which the girl said, "He's the most powerful man in the world, and all he wants to do is make sure I'm safe." Or take the invention of the mythical security mom, who supposedly was desperate for a presidential sheriff to protect her and her children. Or all the rhetoric about how we were going to rescue Afghani women from their burqas, or save the Iraqi women from Saddam Hussein's rape rooms. It would be one thing if we just invoked these fantasies to get us through a bad time. But our leaders use these fantasies as a substitute for crucial action. Look at how the New York City firefighters were expected to settle for hero worship in place of the working radios, safety equipment, and the economic support they needed and had begged for in order to be effective heroes. Or the 9/11 widows who got denounced the minute they quit playing the role of helpless homemaker victims and began to push the government for an accounting of the decisions and missteps that led up to 9/11. There are real consequences for acting according to a made-up script, and real people paid them. America as a whole has suffered. Instead of an actual effort to improve national security and hone a working military strategy, we have been fed adolescent fantasies about Amber Alerts and missions accomplished and evildoers crushed. Living in a myth cleared the way for the erosion of civil liberties and government endorsements of torture. It led us into a misbegotten war against a people who had not attacked us and crippled our fight against those who did. And back home, it closed the door on badly needed introspection and insight. Here we are now, 6 years out from the attacks. If the polls on public attitudes are any indication, attitudes toward the war, toward Bush's performance, we as a people finally may be ready to begin asking some hard questions about our response to 9/11. And in that regard, as troubling as all this is, we also live at a moment of possibility. By putting us through a trauma much like the original trauma that produced our national myth, the attacks on 9/11 present us with a historic opportunity to revisit that past and reverse that long denial, to resolve the old story in a new way that honors the country and its true history, to see ourselves and our frailties in a realistic light instead of papering them over with buckskin bravado and dangerous delusions. I want to thank you very much for listening. Thanks. We have a mic.
We can bring the mic to you. Okay.
I think we're on.
Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to ask your opinion on something that happened actually in the presidential coverage in the last few weeks, centering around the latest presidential debate. And in that debate, Senator Clinton seemed to come under quite a bit of pressure from the other presidential candidates as well as from the questioners. And a good part of the media coverage after that seemed to center around her reaction to that and what the media called playing the gender card. And it seemed to break down into two camps. One who said, this is a good strategy because women don't like men attacking women, and so this is a good thing for her. And the other side said, wait, no, they won't like that because she's playing the victim. And I'm less interested in hearing who you might think is right, but I was just wondering what you thought of the media coverage of that instead. I think that might be interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, well, I'm smiling because I actually just wrote a story about this. Oh, no, it's great. I could be accused of having planted that question. I wrote a story for that's on tomdispatch.com, which it then wound up in the LA Times. So, but exactly on this very thing you're talking about, and what was playing the gender card, and what I offer is a third interpretation that this is in either of these things, but that the gender card is always played in every presidential campaign, and what she was doing. And why it was so threatening was that she was not playing the victim card. She was actually sort of horning in on the traditional, male rescuer territory. She was playing the rescuer card, because when you look at from the debates, she went. There was as much irritation about. In the debates she didn't play victim or anything. She just dealt with the debates. I mean, one may not think she did a good job, but that wasn't part of it. But then I guess it was the next day or the day after, she went to Wellesley and she gave this speech about in which she said that this all-female, this all-women's college taught me to deal in the all-male world of presidential politics, and that's when all the all the criticism started about how she was playing the victim. But if you go back and read a transcript of the speech, she was calling on young women to stand up and fight, and she was saying, "We're going to roll up our sleeves. We're going to shatter the glass ceiling. We can." And so essentially, the argument made. Was that she was, the rescuer on the feminist frontier to come to help young women, not only to save young women, but to go along with them as they save themselves. And that really, overturned the apple cart of how we usually play this game. I mean, if you look back on former presidential campaigns over and over, you see where male candidates, if they don't play the rescue card, are in deep trouble. Dukakis being a classic example, when he flubbed the question in his debate about, what would you do if Kitty Dukakis was raped and murdered, and when he didn't, fly into a, John Wayne frenzy, his poll ratings, dropped through the floor, and to this, day that there's strong feeling, including from himself, that was where he really blew it. But there's example after example of this where, and this is this is part of the problem in the Bush-Kerry campaign, that Kerry figured out the part about being a rough, tough guy, but he failed to get the part of the rescue of the girl, which the Bush handlers really understood, which is why that Ashley's story, that $17 million ad was so effective. Yeah. Oh, I don't have the. You have to. Oh, here. Or you could stand up and shout it. Next over here. Yes, people could shout it if you want, but then
she can repeat it,
or I can repeat it, but then you have to trust me to get it right.
You're not going to believe this, Momish. I'm a descendant of Hannah Dustin.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yeah. And I was thinking about her when you started to talk about notable women. And as you know, the first statue of a woman built in the U.S. is of her. And my grandmother has told me the story, and I don't know if this is something you know or not, or it's just has been passed down through the family. But when she was stolen from her home, she was also taken with her baby. And the baby started crying. Her captors smashed the baby against the tree. And then she was being held in a tent or something with another man. And her captors had gotten drunk, and she scalped them.
Right.
And in those days, women didn't get the rewards. So, and you could get reward money. So she went back and got their scalps, but then she had to give the scalps to her husband to turn in, because the women were not allowed the reward money. But as far as this, everything you've described post 9/11 of protecting the woman and child seems a bit naive, because I think one of the meanest people you'd ever want to deal with is a new mother protecting her baby.
It's incredibly cool to meet the descendant. That's great. The story of the statues. There were actually three, and I talk about this in the book. There were three attempts at statues. There was the first attempt by some private fans of hers. These were all in the Victorian, in the 19th century, and the first one. They tried to raise money and got so far and started building the statue, and then they ran out of money, and the rest of the townspeople said, no, we don't want to have anything to do with this woman. And so what the sort of monument that they had half built was yanked up and moved to another town and refashioned as a soldier from a Civil War soldier. And then there's a second one that was built in the woods, which has her very powerful, and she's standing with the hatchet in one hand and this bouquet of scalps in the other, and she's huge and monumental. And that was really the first statue built. And then there's the last statue, which was built in Haverhill, in her hometown. That one was with public money and approved by the Founding Fathers, and she became suddenly much smaller and not at all the monumental figure. And she's sort of dangling the hatchet. She's not really raising it, and there's nothing in the other hand. But what's interesting is that statue is officially considered the first statue of a woman in America. When in fact it's actually the statue in the woods, which stands to this day, but you can, it sort of fell into disrepair, and it's still kind of, you can't even see it from the road. You have to go in there and hike past all the candy wrappers to uncover it.
Okay, you said at the end that we could rewrite the myth and change the ending, but I want to know, how could we do that? I mean, if another 9/11 happened and the media machine started going, they started repeating the myth, how would we fight it?
Well, I wish I had an answer to that question. And it's a very, to start with, we'd have to be willing. First of all, we'd have to be willing to recognize that this is a myth, which is an uphill battle right there. Because it's sort of taken as a bedrock given. It's not, particularly in the media and popular and political culture. So we have to be willing as a society to begin to diagnose it and confront it. As to the question of what we could replace it with, there are, any number of other possibilities. It requires us having a vision of what the country represents, what we want the country to represent. I mean, one possibility would be to just reclaim some of what our founders described as their vision of an America and based on democracy and liberty and tolerance. And what's striking is that the founders were steeped in these early frontier wars I'm talking about, but they responded not by contracting civil liberties, but expanding them. So it is possible to go in another direction. And you saw the inklings of that right after 9/11 with the people in Lower Manhattan who. And people across the country who, tried to, race to ground zero or tried to contribute in some way. In those first days, there were many people who responded with compassion and solidarity, and out of a sort of recognition of vulnerability instead of, sort of a smothering of that knowledge. But very soon, our commercial, outlets of media and politics and took over and wiped out that approach. But it's still, it's still there for us to pick up if we have the courage to do it. But it will take great courage and an awful lot of organizing.
Yeah. I have a quick question, sort of, I think. Right. I just recently, I'm way over here to your left.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. I just recently finished a book that was called The Global Woman, and it kind of partly discussed something called the care deficit, which, if people don't know what that is, it's basically I guess domestic type of work that is coming from different parts of the globe, since a lot of, I guess, care has been taken out of the home and been put into these working environments because women have gone more towards a career and stuff like that. And so I was just curious maybe what your aspect on that was, since a lot of your writing and stuff like that has to do with the equality of women and that subject. So I'm just curious how you feel about the common problem now with the care deficit.
Well, it's a care deficit in cultures like ours because we choose to not have a political solution to inequality, to not recognize that it's not just about individual choices, but it's about changing the whole playing field. And you compare that with, say, Scandinavian countries, or at this point, a lot of European countries who have set up, subsidized daycare, where the work week is shorter for both men and women, where paid maternity leave, where education is free, where health insurance is covered completely, where there's national health insurance, and where the values are such that it's not all about you're worthless unless you go out there and make a killing in the hedge fund market. I mean that these are the things that if we altered, we would not be outsourcing as we do everything from everything that matters from caring for children, to, there was just a story in the New York Times the other day about, I don't know if you all read it, with this couple decided they were going to move to New York and they hired somebody to get a life for them. The sort of outsourcing of any kind of personal experience, and characterized in the name of, individual choice. And I think where we've gone off the rails is that we've forgotten that feminism isn't just about individual choices. It's about being a full citizen, being a participant in an active way in the public world. It's about public responsibility, and part of that is coming up with a social system that works for everyone. That doesn't mean you hand over the perceived scut work to people that you underpay and basically mistreat. Thank you.
It's a little hard to imagine a better line to end the Q&A on than that one. So what I'll do is invite you all to have some dessert, punch, and coffee, and to take advantage of the bookstore table and get your books signed.